Hey everybody, and welcome back to the read along of using semiotics in marketing. It's so great to be back with you again this week. I hope you're enjoying this as much as I am. It's been really a pleasure to see the LinkedIn group progressing and people asking lots of interesting questions, talking about their projects. I can't wait to see where all of this is going to lead over the next couple of weeks. So what we're going to do today is talk about chapters 4 to 6 of the book. And so if we've got any new listeners with us, I think we do have one or two people who've joined recently. Don't worry, you can kind of jump right in. Conveniently, we're just at the stage where we're analysing some data. What I want to do is talk about that today. So I'm going to talk briefly about the topics of each of these three chapters. So chapter 4 concerns the analysis of signs and symbols, which is called bottom-up analysis. That's mostly what people know about. Chapter 5 concerns how to decode culture and social trends, big questions of how society works. And chapter 6 is about some of the tools that you'll find in the semiotic toolbox that will help you to think more creatively and to innovate. So these are the chapters that we're discussing this week. There's another summary there of the types of things that we're talking about. So when you're looking at signs and codes for your bottom-up analysis, you're probably in the territory of looking at things like ads, packaging, marketing communications, and even political advertising and things like that. When you're analysing culture and social change, this is where you're going to be very interested in evidence of people's mass behaviour, or cross-cultural differences around the world that can be documented, or historical change over time. All of that is helpful in letting you form a big picture of what's going on in the world and where we're headed. And then when we're on to creativity and innovation, there are a bunch of specific tools that you can use to help you think more creatively. And a few of those are documented in the book in some detail. So we've got things like truisms, memes, playing around with scale, that is making things larger or smaller than expected, making semiotic squares and so forth. So hopefully if you've been reading along, those are the chapters that you've just finished consuming, so to speak. And let me see what I can do to say useful things about that content. So last time we spoke, I promised you that each time we met, I would bring you some kind of business news, and I'm kind of regretting that now, because clearly the major event of the last 3 weeks has been the George Floyd murder in the United States. And quite a few people have asked me to comment on the semiotics of it, of this hugely distressing event, which has, I guess, united so many people around the world in so many different countries. And I kind of felt obliged to say something about it from a semiotic point of view, because people are asking me to talk about it. I decided to go and look up some headlines in the Financial Times for the sole reason that I don't usually read the Financial Times. You know, I kind of know what sort of headlines I would expect to find in other, perhaps more liberal newspapers, but the FT was one that I didn't automatically know how they would be reporting on it, so I went to have a look. And there's quite a lot of coverage in the FT. There are quite a bit of this sort of commentary that you see up at the top about economic disparity in the United States and why that persists, which is a really interesting topic. And then there's also commentary on Trump's hopes for the next election. And that should be interesting to us as semiologists. And it is a signal of some of the things I'm going to talk about today. In this headline, Trump hopes that a tough stance on crime will propel him to election victory, because this is an important platform for Trump, and we'll take a look at why that would be. So these are some of the things that, if we're going to talk about news, this is the news, isn't it? And so I'll try to say useful things about semiotics today with carefully using some of this stuff as examples. Okay, so a summary then. If you is where he's been, shall we say, excitable, and he's had plenty to say for himself, and the members of the public have been responding to that quite freely as well. So if you're a semiologist or a researcher with an interest in topical issues, then these kinds of tweets are exactly the sort of thing that you might find yourself looking at. and using the techniques in chapters 4, 5, and 6, you're going to be looking for these specific things. So number one, you're going to look for some semiotic signs. That means words and images, right? So we're going to notice this interesting graphic device here on the lower left corner, where tramp is made into a letter of a word that spells out failure, which is quite an interesting graphic device, but I'm not convinced is going to be persuasive to people on the opposite side of the political fence. And then, so we've got, what we've got here is something which begins to look like left-wing commentators being quite good at making striking visual images, but where Trump, that's not how Trump competes. Trump competes with words, with slogans like "Make America Great Again" and "Law and Order," as you can see here. And that could be an essential part of his strategy for speaking to more conservatively minded voters. So you're going to start by looking, of course, at these sorts of words and images and noticing what's distinctive about them, and who is skilled with what kinds of communications. Then from using your top-down analysis in chapter 5, you're going to consider power. Who seems to have more power, for example, in the short conversation that you can see here. Who has the power in that situation? Does it seem like power might be changing hands? The reason we want to think about this stuff is because it alters the meaning of semiotic signs, and that's important for your clients when they're putting together their brand communications, which might include things like political advertising or human rights advertising. And thirdly, as you'll see from chapter 6, another thing you can do with this data set here is to look for truisms. You can look for ideas which are presented as self-evidently true, like America should be great again, or law and order is self-evidently a good thing. And you can flip those things around and inspect what happens if you treat the opposite of those truisms as also being true. So here what you've got in chapters 4, 5, and 6 are some handy ways for you to tackle this kind of data set with a sense of purpose and with some actual kind of system and procedure at hand. What you want to do throughout this is really try and stay focused on your client's business objectives, even if they're an imaginary client for the purpose of the project that you're doing as we pursue this read along. You need to stay focused on your client's business objectives, unless you're an academic, in which case do as whatever you think is important to do. For those of us who are in business and outside of full-time academia, you need to stay focused on what your client wants to accomplish, okay? Not many people are going to want to pay you to do research just because it is interesting. Probably your client has some objective in mind. Like, it occurred to me when I was looking at these political messages on social media platforms like Twitter, that Donald Trump is great at making the conversation all about him. So he's great at stirring up support and his remaining supporters. And he's great at making his opponents talk about him as well, with the result that hardly people don't talk about Joe Biden enough, probably, you know. And so there are going to be a lot of people who are entrenched either on the left or the right-hand side of the political map. And those people are largely speaking to themselves. And I think that's what we find with like Trump shouting things like "Make America Great Again," and the sorts of, like that failure graphic that we just looked at, which comes from a left-wing protester. What we see in those types of communications is people preaching to an audience who are already converted. They're preaching to people who are similar to themselves already. If from a business point of view, if you're a researcher, what your client is going to be interested in is a bunch of people in the middle of the political spectrum who potentially could be persuaded, who are presumed to be somewhat susceptible to political messaging of some kind, okay? So it's these people in the middle, those floating voters, who you really need to be paying attention to, more than the sort of people who produce this very kind of orthodox characteristic visual and verbal messages for their different parties. So we can use semiotics to think about what matters to those people. Like, is it crime, for example, or something like that, law and order or safety or something like that, and think about how we can design messages that address them using their own dialect. For example, maybe if you are talking to voters who are moderately conservative, you should try focusing on words rather than visual images, because I think it's one thing that Trump gets right. So what we want to do then is because we're in business, is stay focused on the practical objectives of your project all the time. Right, okay, let's see what else we've got for you. Okay, so I've covered most of this already, but here's just a kind of useful visual summary for you to take away with you, if you like. It's almost like illustrations that I wish we could have been able to include in the book. So if you're looking at visual images, this is what I mean about the left wing on the whole is better with visual images than the right wing. So Donald Trump is not particularly visually engaging in his own right. He kind of has to rely quite hard on these red hats and this kind of thing. Like, photography is not really his thing, and consequently he relies on I guess a PR team and friendly journalists who will supply visual images that don't have him in shot, which are more persuasive, like police stations which are on fire and things like that. And then here we've got a mural of George Floyd and various other important figures there, like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. And this is the left wing doing what it does really well, which is to kind of stir up emotions with these visual communications. And what we're beginning to see here as well, though, is a couple of different kinds of codes. As we're looking at these signs, we're also looking at codes. So one code is about an inherently conservative code about restoring former glory and reverting to tradition and history and stuff like that. And the other one is forward looking. It's a very definition of progressive. It talks about being time to change the world, and so on and so on. Let's see if we can get this one. I'm just going to briefly mention this. What you're looking at here is actually a series of photos that I took in the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, DC. And they are photographs of a vinyl floor with lots of text on it. And it's part of a massive exhibition by Barbara Kruger, whose name I've included down on the bottom right here, and whose work you should look up, because when it comes to doing top-down analysis of how society works, Barbara Kruger has done a lot of the heavy lifting for you already, you'll be happy to know. So you must look her up and find out what she's doing, because she's a reliably interesting person, okay? So what she's done here with this installation on this vinyl floor in this art museum is she's decorated the whole lobby with political prompts, if you like, prompts for thinking. And what she's offering you here as a prompt is look for the moment when pride becomes contempt. And so what we're doing here is a kind of top-down analysis. So we might observe, for example, that Donald Trump, as you might expect, has a habit of appealing to, I guess, people's national pride. And there are probably plenty of voters who are willing to take him up on that invitation. And that's fine. But if we want to be critical about it, which semiotics is itself a critical activity, we have to ask whether there is a moment where pride turns into contempt of people who are not like you, or contempt of people who are not like ourselves. And this obviously is going to be critically important for identifying things like systemic and casual racism and things like that. So this is what we're doing here, is when we're looking, what we might do then as a result of this prompt is to go back to our data set and look for examples of Trump or indeed his opponents talking about pride or national pride or any other type of pride, see if we can identify if there's a moment where it sort of fails or goes wrong. And then here's the third bit. So in chapter 6, I talk a lot about truisms, which is a technique that I use every day almost, where when you're looking at a data set like this political discourse, you try to identify a couple of truisms, like, for example, gangs are bad would be a great one. Gangs are very much used by Republicans in political advertising in various parts of the US as a way of motivating voters to take a more conservative view. So gangs themselves have become part of the semiotic landscape. They're part of this currency of advertising. So there's a truism here, which is gangs are bad. Another truism, which is kind of relevant to the current civil unrest, is this idea that we need the police to stay safe. And so you can choose to, as a researcher, investigate the hypothesis that the opposite of these things is also true. And I guarantee, and we can talk about this in the Q&A afterwards, that there's a reasonable truism that is the precise opposite of those things, which says that gangs serve a useful purpose, and that maybe the police themselves would benefit from having less to do. So there's interesting stuff to be discovered, which you can then make a diplomatic decision about whether you want to include it in your client's marketing campaign. So let's talk about your projects. That's it from me. I hope that's been exciting for you. Those are three of my favourite chapters in the book. Data analysis never gets boring. Let's talk about that now. Just briefly, here's what's coming up over the next couple of weeks. Next time I see you, we're going to do part 3. I'm going to ask you to go out between now and then. Now we're finally allowed outdoors, and go out and have a look at some stuff outside, do a field trip. And I'll also do some talking about ethnography and discourse analysis. And we'll do some talk about how to turn insights into marketing strategy. And then part 4 will be our final session, 23rd of July. And we'll get on to some exciting stuff there. Will help you move into the future with your career in semiotics. So that's, I guess, all from me for now. Let me hand back over to Ray, and let's talk about this week's chapters.